Haviv Rettig is one of the chief correspondents for the Times of Israel. I listen to Haviv whenever he's on Dan Senor's podcast, Call Me Back. I also am now listening, Haviv, to your standalone pods over at Times of Israel. I listen to the daily podcast at Times of Israel. I try and keep up with Israel's war of survival in Gaza with all of those podcasts. I listen to Daniel Hartman and Yossi Klein Halevi, Michael Oren's on a lot. But I think Americans have got a fundamental misunderstanding about what's going on. Fundamental. And you said it on Sunday. This war is not going to end until Hamas is destroyed, dismantled. Why is that, and when is that in sight?
I think it's very simple. Hamas made it simple. Hamas is one of these kinds of enemies that make things very simple. They want to destroy Israel. They want to destroy Israel for very big, very dramatic reasons. They have a vision of Islamic renewal and redemption. They're a particularly radical form of Islam. They are willing to destroy Gaza to achieve that end. In other words, Hamas has ruled Gaza for 17 years, and in those 17 years, this is a Google challenge for our listeners, it has built nothing in Gaza except the tunnels. And it built those tunnels for no reason other than to start this war and then force Israel. The only way to get them out of Gaza once this kind of war is started is to go through the civilian population. That's the whole story of Hamas. Hamas, and by the way, Hezbollah. What is Hezbollah's great strategy in Lebanon? Hezbollah has already basically made Lebanon a failed state. Listeners should Google the Houthi war in Yemen. 85,000 children have starved to death in that war. The Iranian proxies, everywhere they are demolishing their own societies. And Iran itself has probably spent a double-digit percentage of its economy just on this dream of destroying Israel. And so at some point you look at the enemy and you say, I believe you. I take you seriously. This doesn't stop until Hamas in Gaza, the regime of Hamas in Gaza, is destroyed. If it isn't, then we're going to be back here in this war in Gaza with Gazans suffering terribly, with Israelis facing whatever new crazy scheme and horrific atrocity Hamas manages to cook up in 10 years.
What I heard you say to Dan with great clarity is that 90% of Israel agrees with the proposition that Hamas must be destroyed and that Israel is not turning back. There isn't any division in the country that reflects the division in the United States that we see with Kamala Harris's incoherence and Joe Biden's occasional rambling, but the demonstrations in the street. That doesn't exist in Israel. We do see demonstrations on behalf of the hostage families, and our heart goes out to them. But the odds of getting back all those hostages are now objectively very low, and the only way to do it is with war and going into Rafah. But Ramadan looms. I wanted to ask you, do you give a lick? Do Israelis give a lick that Ramadan is coming up, given that the fundamentalist Hamas group has attacked on one of your holy days, and before that, the Yom Kippur War 50 years ago was launched on one of your holy days? Does Israel actually going to hold back through all of Ramadan, not to go into Rafah?
I think you said it exactly right. You know, the Arab world, the Arab countries, in their own choice of scheduling wars when it was their war to start, for example, the 73 war, they didn't just start the war on Ramadan. They called it the glorious Ramadan War. And so the idea that you can't fight wars on Ramadan it's a new invention special for Israel. That's not serious. There is a real concern in Ramadan, and the concern is that throughout the Muslim world, people generally are resting during the day over the course of Ramadan because they fast during the daylight hours, and it's a time of tremendous amount of, for example, peak television watching. So there are special series produced all year to watch on Ramadan, and so everyone is tuned in to Al Jazeera, and any conflict between Israelis and Palestinians becomes headline news everywhere in the Muslim world over Ramadan. So there's a kind of heightened tension over Ramadan. I have to tell you, that doesn't mean our hostages sit another month. It doesn't mean Hamas survives an extra month unnecessarily. Why should we genuinely worry about Ramadan when they frankly used a Sabbath holiday overlap on Simchat Torah on October 7th to attack us, when they themselves would gladly attack us on Ramadan? So the whole idea, I think, is a little bit silly.
It is. It's also standing in the way of getting real relief to Gazan civilians. Because the only way to actually get relief into Gaza is to secure Gaza from Hamas terrorists and allow the relief trucks to be protected by a third party or by Israel itself. Am I speaking the truth there? The only way to really get aid to Gaza is to end the war with Hamas. And the only way to end the war with Hamas is to go into Rafah, get Sinwar, and close off their last battalions, dismantle them. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Every time Hamas has any ability to manage, run, distribute aid, huge amounts, sometimes most of the aid disappears. It's feeding Hamas's own battalions. They have stockpiles of food and resources and gas for electricity in their tunnels while Gazans are hungry. Israel needs, this is also a criticism I have of Israel, of our government and how we're handling the war. It's taking us a long time to realize that the IDF was much more successful, much more quickly than we expected. And so our control of the ground, our control of the need for us to really take control of the whole humanitarian aid situation has come faster than the army was planning. But Gazans are ordinary. Gazans are actually suffering. We need to be able to clear them out of certain areas to fight Hamas better in those areas, especially, for example, the last city where we haven't actually gone into, which is Rafah. If we are to defeat Hamas, we need, I think, an Israeli-run massive humanitarian aid operation in Gaza. And that's something that a little bit surprised us because the war went, frankly, better than we expected in military terms.
Now, you know, Haviv, Americans understanding this have to view this war through the lens of our failed effort in Afghanistan, which was successful for 2 months and failed for 20 years. Or in Iraq, where we overtoppled Saddam in 2 months and then we lost, or are in the process of losing, though our troops are still there at al-Assad and other bases. They don't understand. I don't think a majority of Americans understand. Gaza is not Iraq or Afghanistan. There is no rat line back to Pakistan or in Saddam's case, Iran. There is no way for Hamas to get resupplied. So that you can actually beat Hamas. Am I correct?
They do have smuggling tunnels from Egypt. A lot of Egyptian officials make a lot of money, corrupt money, in allowing that smuggling operation. One of the reasons that we need to take Rafah is to cut that last supply line. But by and large, that's the exception to the rule. The rule, you are correct. Hamas can be entirely cut off from its supporters, from its patrons, whether that's Qatar or Iran. And it can, the regime, right? I don't know what it means to destroy the idea. I don't need to destroy the idea. The regime in Gaza can be destroyed, absolutely.
Well, on that note,
and by the way, I should say America did that in northern Iraq to ISIS. In other words,
yes.
For every Afghanistan, there are examples of tremendous American successes. Even
yesterday on commentary, and I know you've been a guest of John and the gang over at the Commentary Pod, which I listen to every day. John made the note that if Hamas is defeated in full, it may be the turning point in Palestinian consciousness about their doomed war to destroy Israel, that the light may finally come on if Hamas is root and branch taken out of Gaza. Do you agree with John?
I do. I think that's the heart of things. I think that you can love Israel, you can hate Israel. It doesn't really matter what you think of Israel. At the end of the day, the Palestinian ideological elites, the factions especially, but not only Hamas, tell Palestinians this story that they think gives them dignity, that they think gives Hamas a real power in the Palestinian political world. And the story is the Jews can be removed. Now, as long as there is a chance, and your leaders are telling you the Jews can be removed, it becomes treason to seek any kind of accommodation, reconciliation. It literally just becomes collaboration, because you could actually win outright. If they as soon as they come to the conclusion that you cannot win outright, the Jews have nowhere to go, you can't remove them, then accommodation, nonviolence, all these other options that would actually work for them. You know, one of the interesting things in this war has been to watch the Israeli political left. Israeli left-wing voters, even deep left voters, are in the army fighting shoulder to shoulder with right-wing voters. They are fighting to remove Hamas from Gaza, remove Hamas from the Palestinian equation, so that they can then look forward to a kind of peace, a kind of reconciliation, when that option is gone from the table that Palestinians can continue to chase after. So absolutely, the heart of this conflict is the Palestinian conclusion that we cannot be removed, and seeking other ways to move forward other than endless terrorism, which hasn't worked for a century.
For our first segment, I want to close it here in a couple of minutes, Haviv. Can you explain the extent of consensus within Israel? Because people listen to Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, they get the wrong impression. The extent of the consensus on the need to finish the war with the dismantling of every Hamas battalion, the destruction of every tunnel, and the death or the exile of Sinwar and the upper leadership of the Hamas in Gaza. What's the extent of the consensus?
We have polls on this. Israelis are torn when you ask about hostages. But if you leave aside the question of hostages, let's pretend there aren't. In other words, they're willing to compromise. Some Israelis, a minority, but nevertheless they exist, are willing to compromise on the immediate destruction of Hamas in exchange for getting the hostages out. They are a minority of Israelis. Then you say to them, leaving hostages aside, do we destroy Hamas? 90% want to destroy Hamas. There simply aren't, and that, probably 7% don't know, like in any survey. So there simply aren't Israelis of any appreciable numbers, of any statistically relevant number, who don't see Hamas as something that we cannot live next to. I have to tell you, Hezbollah is the same story. In the north, right now, the American envoy to Lebanon just said yesterday, we have to find a diplomatic solution. Diplomatic solution is the only solution. But I have to tell you that on the ground, 86,000 Israelis won't go home to their towns in the north. And on the Lebanese side of the border, there are 100,000 Lebanese residents of the 200 villages of South Lebanon who also haven't gone home in 5 months. If you just go by the wisdom of the crowds, of ordinary people and what they think is happening, there's a war coming, because there's a war coming. Hezbollah.
And I don't know that Americans know that. During our break, that will be on our podcast, and I'll be back on the radio show with Haviv in about 6 minutes, so stay tuned. But there is a war coming, and Americans don't know it because our political leadership, not Israel, is confused, worried about Dearborn, Michigan, absolutely wrong-headed to let Kamala Harris be the messenger because she screwed it up, as did President Biden. I'll talk about what Haviv thinks about American messaging when we come back for the podcast, and I'll be back on the radio in 6 minutes. Stay tuned to the Hugh Hewitt Show. Back now with Haviv Rettig of the Times of Israel. Haviv, I've been asking my guests for the 20 years since 9/11, 23 years, have they read The Looming Tower by Lawrence Wright? Because it explains Sayyid Qutb and the Muslim Brotherhood, and why Sadat had to take them out, and why they killed Sadat, and how Mubarak got toppled by them, and why Sisi doesn't want to let it explains it all. If you read under the, I can't remember the name of the book of Qutb, but he wrote 2 books, Milestones and Under the Shade of Some Sort of Tree, you realize they're fanatics. You're never going to deal with them. Our leadership, American leadership, doesn't seem to get this. So what do you, Haviv, as an Israeli, think about President Biden warning Bibi not to carpet bomb, which you've never done and won't do, and Kamala Harris just getting it all wrong? I mean, how do you react to the ignorance of Americans on this?
You put me in a bad spot, and I'll tell you why. President Biden and many other presidents, Republican and Democratic, have done a lot for Israel. And I am a firm believer in 2 things. First of all, in gratitude. Gratitude is a commandment that we are given by Judaism, and I want to be grateful. And so it's hard for me to now, I think that there are policy mistakes. I think that there are specific ideas that they've been getting wrong in this administration. I criticized a great deal the Obama administration. I had some concerns with the Trump administration, but not so much in the Middle East. I don't, and I don't want to get into domestic American politics at all. It's not my place. That's first of all. Second of all, let me tell you what Israelis think of America. When President Obama was first sworn in back in 2009, we did a poll. There was a poll of Israelis. He had 70% approval in Israel the day he was sworn in. He was a rock star. And when President Trump was sworn in, he had 70% approval in Israel. He was a rock star. Do you know what Israelis love? They don't really understand the culture war. They understand America itself. The American-led world order, this American idea of democracy and freedom and liberalism changed the world and made the world safer for everybody everywhere. That Israelis understand, and that's what Israelis love. We literally, I mean, we speak Hebrew. You know, we don't understand. I'm paid to pay attention to America, but most Israelis do not. We don't know your culture wars and your abortion and healthcare and those are not issues that are at all on Israelis' radar. So right now, I'll answer your question, but I don't want it to be sort of. I'm trying to give the Israeli mainstream view. I don't want to say Biden is very popular in Israel right at this moment, and by the way, so is Trump. In the same polls, so is Trump. So I think that the one thing that they are missing, and it goes back to Iran, and I have to say, I'm starting to see an awakening. I think they're missing that they really mean it. Hamas means it, and it will destroy Gaza, never mind Israel, on its vision of Islamic redemption and holy war. Hezbollah means it and is willing to see Lebanon destroyed. And Iran has already demolished 4 Arab countries. It will demolish more, and it will demolish until it is either defeated or wins. And if you don't understand that, none of your policies are going to matter. My problem with President Obama's nuclear deal with Iran, it wasn't one of those technical policy issues and policy questions. They had some points, some argument. My problem was that the whole thing was based on trusting Khamenei to actually fulfill his side of the deal. If he doesn't fulfill his side of the deal, you've already released all the hundreds of billions of dollars in sanctions. In other words, there's no capping it back. There's no.
They were on the ropes. We're going to come back on the radio show, Haviv. They were on the ropes. Biden let them off the ropes. Now we got to put them back on the ropes because they are the source of all evil. We'll be right back with Haviv Rettig. Stay tuned. Welcome back, America. Haviv Rettig is my guest. If you listen to the podcast today, you'll hear a segment where he explains the delicacy with which Israelis approach American politics. It is the same deference I pay towards Israeli politics. I don't have any idea. When the Israeli Supreme Court is being debated, I read it with interest, but I don't venture an opinion because I teach constitutional law in America. I don't know anything about constitutional law in Iran, except what Michael Oren has taught me, and he's not a lawyer. So I try and stay out of this. But I do know that we've got Benny Gantz in the country. And I know he is the most popular leader in Israel. Maybe Gallant is, Bibi is not right now. But I don't think it's not an American election. It's not a scrum. Are they fundamentally linked? Do you think Gantz is giving the message? And might Bibi be playing Biden to quote, I believe it was Seth Mandel, but it might have been someone else. Bibi is playing Biden to get as much aid and give Biden as much rope as he wants because you need the weaponry. We get it to you, and we're not going to stop giving it to you. But is Gantz given the message that, hey, we're all together here, and you've got to stop telling us we're doing things wrong. We're not carpet bombing. In fact, I think you've lost 248 soldiers now, which is a remarkably low casualty rate for the kind of plan Hamas had. Do you think Gantz is delivering that message?
I think so. I hope so. I can tell you that Gantz is sort of rose in politics on what we call in Israel the center-left, but he really represents a very centrist. There are a lot of Netanyahu voters in the last election who are polling right now. I mean, a couple 100,000 probably, who are polling right now as supporting Gantz. So he's a very mainstream, middle-of-the-road political leader right now, and that very centrism is what attracts Israelis because there's a war on and the soldiers are fighting and there's a feeling that polarization now is a kind of betrayal of the soldiers and of the country. And so that is what Gantz's fantastic showing in the polls really is about. So I think that he has come to Washington. I don't think he's come to Washington to coordinate with the Biden administration against Netanyahu or run any kind of Israeli political, gambit or anything like that. I really do think he's one of the 5 members of the War Council of the sort of inner cabinet committee that's actually running the war. And I think this is coordinating the war effort. The Biden administration has gotten more and more concerned about humanitarian aid. I have gotten more and more concerned about humanitarian aid. I have a lot of sympathy and understanding for the Israeli government's successful management of the war so far, with this one big problem that we have to solve if we're going to destroy Hamas, if we're going to help shape the day after in ways that are in Israel's interest and safe for Israelis. So I do think that the Israeli government needs to be more present. I think that's what he's basically come to coordinate on. And I think it's basically good news. I don't see politicking and downsides in his visit.
Now, Haviv, what I'm always falling back on is the American experience. And Americans expected, they didn't expect to win quickly in Afghanistan or Iraq. And they did the initial battles, and they lost the long war because there was no planning. But like Bush's view on WMD, which was widely shared among the Democrats, Bibi had a view on Hamas, which is the mow the grass view, which turned out to be wrong. But how widespread was acceptance of his model? Did anyone ever run against him saying, you're wrong about Hamas, they're going to unleash 3,000 barbarians to go like out of the Asia steppe to murder everyone, a pogrom that we haven't seen since the late 1800s, early 1900s? Did anyone disagree with Bibi publicly about his assessment?
Not in the mainstream, but from the far right, you saw some very vociferous, very loud disagreement on that point that said that we actually have to destroy Hamas, remove Hamas, defeat Hamas. It wasn't taken as a very serious view by most of mainstream politicians and political parties because the cost of removing Hamas from Gaza was this war. I mean, the cost was insanely high. As long as things looked stable, as long as it seemed reasonable to take the path of least resistance, why would you take on those incredible costs? So you had these right-wing political parties that said that. You had from the far left some people who said some version of that, not we have to destroy Hamas, but we have to make peace with Hamas, which, they didn't ask Hamas, right? That was something they thought just the Israelis could somehow manage to do. But no, I would say that 80% of Israeli politics, broadly speaking, either backed Netanyahu or didn't actually come up with any alternative to what Netanyahu's policy was.
But it's pass-fail in Israeli politics, right? Either you get it right or you get it wrong, and Bibi got it wrong, and he will pay the price at the next election. We got a minute to our last segment, Haviv.
Yeah, it was his policy. It was a policy he fought for against those right-wingers, even when they were the linchpin in his coalition. He defended it. He allowed hundreds of millions of dollars to be given to Hamas by Qatar. He thought Hamas was a stabilizing force. He was dead wrong. We paid for those 10 years of quiet that he bought us on credit, and politically, he should pay the price.
Quickly, I don't expect elections for a long time. I don't expect this war to be over because I think it's going to go to the north. Do you agree with my assessment?
I don't expect the war to be over because it's really a long war with Iran and will go to the north and maybe even beyond that. But I do think that elections might be possible if the protests start in real force.
I'm coming back for one more segment with Haviv Rettig. Find it on the podcast today. Always find him at Times of Israel, usually on a Sunday night broadcast released by Dan Senor on Call Me Back. Probably the most calm and a younger voice for Israel than Michael Oren and I talking about Israel. So you definitely don't want to miss him whenever you see him. I'll be right back with him in hour number 2 of today's Super Tuesday edition of the Hugh Hewitt Show. So I'm back with Haviv Rettig for my final segment. Haviv, Egypt will not open their border crossing. They're building this giant concrete pen, and I've seen the pictures of it. It seems to me they might have a plan to help you with Rafah by allowing in women and children and boys under the age of 12. Why won't Sisi let them into Egypt? I know the answer, but it better come from you than me.
Yeah, there are two reasons. The first reason is they don't want them. Half of Gaza's population is under the age of 18. Hamas has ruled Gaza for 17 years. Hamas has taught. Hamas teachers, schools have taught half the population of Gaza, and of course much more than that as adults. And Hamas is part of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the mortal enemy of the current regime in Egypt. And so they see the Gazans as literal enemies. Also, they don't want to appear to the Arab world to be helping with what some in the Arab world suspect is an Israeli attempt to push the Palestinians out of Gaza. So right-wing Israelis can build settlements there. That is not what's going on. It's not remotely what's going on. Polls tell us that well above 80% of Israelis don't want that to happen. It's not going to happen. But the image of it is something that the Sisi regime sees as very dangerous for its standing in the Arab world. So it has absolutely sealed that border, both for its own survival and also for the PR of not appearing to help the Israelis clear the Palestinians out of Gaza.
All right, last question, Haviv. The military operation has gone very well. And that's not only your opinion, it's the opinion of people like Daniel Hartman, who I don't really understand what his politics are, or Yossi Klein. It's gone very, very well. Does America know how well it's gone and how careful the IDF has been to proceed cautiously and with proportionate force against a very difficult to find target? Do you think that's been adequately explained, or is that a failure of the IDF to communicate?
Well, first of all, yeah, I think the IDF's not very good at communicating. Luckily, it's good at other things. But I would say that we are also living in the shadow of a really profound change that came over the IDF over the last 5 months. The army that went into Gaza City, the northernmost of Gaza's cities, was an army that hadn't really fought a serious ground war in 2 generations. And it's an army that solved most of the problems that it ever faced with the Air Force. And now it saw these astonishing tunnel networks and Hamas hiding in those tunnel networks, and it decided to try to solve the problem. You know, it had a hammer, so it decided that everything is a nail. And so you saw airstrikes at a scale that really, really caused civilian harm that was televised on TikTok in ways that I don't think it was more in how these things are measured than what happened in Mosul, but it was certainly televised more than what happened in Mosul. By the time the army 2 months later gets into Khan Yunis, it's a ground operation, it's a ground army that has learned how to fight on the ground. There's only so much training you can give an army. Experience is by far the most important kind of training. And by the time the army is coming to central Gaza and Khan Yunis, it knows how to pull those Hamas guys out of the tunnels. It knows how to kill them. It knows how to destroy the tunnels with much, much less civilian harm, with much less airstrikes. And so you saw a huge reduction in the rate of Palestinian deaths, and that's only gone. The army itself has become more expert. Hamas has started dying at a higher rate. At one point, Hamas even had to admit it had any losses, right? It claimed 6,000 dead by the time Israel was saying it had 13,000 dead fighters. Hamas had to claim some dead fighters because everyone was just laughing at the fact that, according to Hamas's death toll rates out of Gaza, there were 0 Hamas fighters dead for 4 months. But the point is that the army has gotten better, more targeted, more able to protect civilians while pulling Hamas out of those tunnels. Hamas's only strategy is mass civilian deaths. Yahya Sinwar, Hamas's leader, is sitting in a tunnel under Rafah, or probably under Rafah, possibly in Khan Yunis, and he is thinking to himself one big thought. He needs 5 times as many Palestinian civilian dead. That's what might, he hopes, stop the Israeli war machine. He has no other strategy. Hamas has no other strategy other than Palestinian civilian death. And so our learning how to fight them from under the civilians with a much reduced rate of civilian deaths on the Palestinian side has been a game changer for our ability to actually destroy Hamas. So the answer is, first of all, yes. Second of all, increasingly so. And third of all, Hamas isn't a real problem because we know how to kill them without killing a lot of Palestinians now.
Last question then. When do you expect the operation against Rafah to commence? When does Haviv, I know you're not tied in with the IDF, you're not a spokesman for the government, but what does Israel want? Do they want it sooner, or are they willing to wait for all of Ramadan to pass before they begin? Because that's a nightmare from a PR point of view, if you ask me.
Yeah, it's everything I just said about being able to get at Hamas from under the civilian population in Rafah would be much, much harder because there's such a densely packed civilian population of people who fled from the north and from the center of Gaza. So we have to figure out how to move civilians around when there's very little places to actually move them in order to get to Hamas. It has to happen. I think that the planning is well underway in the army. I think that it's possible it'll start during Ramadan, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, something like that. But I think that there is this desire, and Gantz is in Washington in part to talk about it, there's this desire to really have a solid plan in place for moving the civilians before that final operation starts. You have to assume this is Hamas's last stand. We're going to be in a counterinsurgency for 2-3 years, but this is Hamas's last stand as serious, fully fledged, standing battalions. you have to assume they're going to put up a fight, unlike what we've seen so far, which is them trying but failing to actually put up a serious fight in most places. So I would guess a month, but again, it's a decision of about 5 people. It's very hard to predict what 5 people are going to do, but it makes sense to me on the timeline of the war about a month.
Okay, we have 30 seconds. Your prediction for the next leader of Israel. I know who leads Iran, and God knows who the next nut is going to be as the supreme leader. But how about Israel? Is it going to be Gantz or is it going to be Gallant?
I think it's going to be Gantz first. I don't think Likud, even if Netanyahu falls miserably, Likud is going to be out of power for very long. Likud has strong fundamentals and a loyal base of supporters. And whoever replaces Netanyahu, which right now Gallant looks set to replace him, Likud politics are complicated, it might not be him, but Likud will be back in government within a couple of years, maybe 4 or 5 years, depends on how many election cycles we get.
Always good to talk to you, Haviv. Thank you. You're doing great service to Israel by your working overtime with all these American outlets, and I appreciate your time. Good luck to you. Stay safe.
Thanks, Hugh. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.